Jazz is perhaps at its very best in the album format, or better still, in the spontaneity of a live performance. You could even argue that jazz doesn't naturally lend itself to the standalone song format, and yet jazz had its own hits. The standards of the Great American Songbook served much the same purpose back then as pop singles would later do on the charts. Miles Davis never cared much for musical conventions or fixed formats, but he always kept a close eye on what was happening around him musically, even beyond the world of jazz. Today, we're going to discover which 20 Miles Davis songs ultimately rose above the rest. Last week, we ranked all 55 of Miles Davis's studio albums. Today, we're taking it one step further. Out of hundreds of recordings, we're selecting his 20 greatest songs. And that turned out to be far more difficult than I expected. Some classics were guaranteed a place from the very beginning, but the number one spot might actually surprise you. That's exactly why I'm so curious to hear whether you agree with my choices. Are you ready? Let's go! We're kicking off this list with one of the biggest surprises in Miles Davis's remarkable catalog. Sweet Pea comes from Water Babies, an album that wasn't released until years later, even though it consists of recordings from the Nefertiti and Miles in the Sky sessions. As you saw last week, Water Babies finished surprisingly high in the album ranking. Sweet Pea perfectly explains why. It's a hidden gem that captures Miles's second great quintet at the very peak of its powers. The composition radiates calm, sophistication, and musical interplay of the highest order. It may not be Miles's best-known track, but it's a beautiful way to open our top 20. One place higher, we find a timeless classic by Thelonious Monk, a composition that Miles Davis recorded several times throughout his career, but it never sounded more convincing than it does on the album that bears its name. The restrained trumpet, the dark atmosphere, and the exquisite interplay between the musicians make this one of the most enduring ballads in jazz history. It's a piece that doesn't break the silence of the night. It embraces it. And somehow, that makes the darkness just a little easier to bear. At number 18, we find the opening track from the soundtrack to Ascenseur pour l'échafaud. No other piece on the album captures the atmosphere of this classic film noir quite like Générique. The music is inseparable from the iconic images of Jean Moreau silently wandering the streets of Paris at night. The haunting echo of Miles's muted trumpet draws you into the story from the very first note. And once you're inside, there's no escaping it. You simply have to surrender to the melancholy, the suspense, and above all, the irresistible beauty of Miles' trumpet playing. For the documentary Jack Johnson, Miles Davis recorded music that would later become one of the most remarkable albums of his electric period. The album contains just 2 compositions, but each one occupies almost an entire side of the record. Yesternow is the longer of the 2. An irresistible funk riff provides the foundation for more than 25 minutes of hypnotic musical exploration, as Miles and his band constantly venture into new territory. At the very end, we hear a quote from the documentary that perfectly captures the significance of Jack Johnson. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, but above all, he was a black man in America in 1908. That historical perspective gives Yesternow a powerful and deeply moving conclusion. At number 16, we find the breathtaking Stella by Starlight, a jazz standard composed by Victor Young in 1944. Miles recorded the piece in 1958 with the same legendary sextet that would immortalize Kind of Blue just 1 year later. The recording was originally released on Jazz Track, a rather unusual compilation that paired the music from Ascenseur pour l'échafaud with 3 newly recorded studio tracks. It wasn't until much later that these recordings found their way onto expanded editions of Kind of Blue as bonus material. And honestly, that feels surprisingly fitting. The atmosphere, the interplay, and the timeless beauty blend seamlessly with that masterpiece. In fact, Had Stella by Starlight been included on the original release of Kind of Blue, it might well be regarded today as one of Miles Davis's most iconic songs. Like Stella by Starlight, On Green Dolphin Street also comes from those legendary 1958 recording sessions. It, too, was recorded with the remarkable sextet that would go on to make Kind of Blue just 1 year later. The quality of both performances is incredibly close. Even so, I give On Green Dolphin Street the slight edge. Its melody settles into your mind just a little more quickly, and the beautiful transition from the restrained opening into the swinging main section makes this a track I keep coming back to. This is Miles at his most elegant, relaxed, melodic, and displaying the effortless confidence that only the very greatest musicians possess. While Jack Johnson would later fill an entire LP with just 2 explosive compositions, In a Silent Way takes a completely different approach. Side 1 is devoted entirely to Shh, Peaceful, a composition driven not by power but by atmosphere. Here, Miles Davis takes his first truly convincing step into electric jazz, delivering an instant, timeless masterpiece. The music feels almost weightless as the different electric pianos slowly weave around one another. The result is at once serene, smoldering, and almost feverish. This isn't a piece where you listen for what happens next. Instead, you're gradually drawn into a world entirely of its own. Shh. Peaceful isn't a composition that's trying to go anywhere. It's a world you're invited to inhabit for a while. At number 13, we find the emotional heart of Sketches of Spain, Concierto de Aranjuez. Gil Evans transformed Joaquin Rodrigo's celebrated guitar concerto into a breathtaking orchestral work, with Miles Davis taking center stage without ever overpowering the music. It's precisely the restraint in his playing that makes every single note so powerful. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Miles and Gil Evans may well have been the most extraordinary partnership in jazz history. And if I had to choose one recording that best captures the essence of their collaboration, it would be this one. This is music that doesn't try to impress you. It simply leaves you speechless. 4 places above Yesternow, we find the other side of Jack Johnson, Right Off. The track opens with an irresistible guitar vamp by John McLaughlin, driving the groove relentlessly for several minutes before Miles finally joins in. According to the story, Miles arrived at the studio later, giving McLaughlin the freedom to create what has since become one of the most legendary openings in Miles' catalog. Right Off is razor-sharp, relentlessly funky, and, at nearly 27 minutes, a true tour de force of Miles' electric period. It forms the perfect bridge between the adventurous improvisations of Bitches Brew and the uncompromising urban funk of On the Corner, while remaining more accessible than either album. It's exactly that combination that earns Right Off its well-deserved place at number 12. It's quite a leap from the raw funk of Right Off to the almost fairy tale-like melody of Someday My Prince Will Come. Originally written for Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, this familiar tune is transformed by Miles Davis into a beautifully refined jazz ballad. The lineup makes the recording even more special. Alongside Hank Mobley, Miles's regular tenor sax player at the time, we also hear John Coltrane, who returned for one final session. 2 giants on a single recording. Miles plays the melody with such patience and elegance that you almost forget it ever came from a Disney film. Once again, it proves that a truly great composition can effortlessly transcend its original setting and flourish in an entirely different musical world. We've reached the top 10, and we're doing so with perhaps the biggest surprise of this entire list. Love for Sale is a Cole Porter standard that many Miles Davis fans tend to overlook. That's understandable, because the track wasn't included on the original release of Kind of Blue. It wasn't added until much later, on expanded reissues of the album. And that's actually hard to believe. The atmosphere, the interplay, and the timeless sound blend seamlessly with that masterpiece. Once again, the chemistry between Miles Davis and John Coltrane is nothing short of extraordinary. turning these 11-plus minutes into one of the hidden treasures of Miles' catalog. Record companies love to reissue classic albums over and over again, hoping collectors will buy yet another copy. Most of the time, I don't fall for it. But in this case, I'm more than happy to make an exception. Because let's be honest, you can never own too many copies of Kind of Blue. At number 9, we find In a Silent Way. It's about that time, a beautifully expansive piece of music that producer Teo Macero assembled with surgical precision. The transition from the dreamlike title theme into the slowly building groove feels so natural that it's easy to forget just how revolutionary this style of editing was at the time. While both sides of the album are brilliant and you best experience it as one long trip, this is the composition I find myself returning to just a little more often. It offers more stillness, more space, and perfectly illustrates how Miles could create an entire musical world with just a handful of notes. At number 8, we have the magnificent closing track from Kind of Blue, Flamenco Sketches. Rarely has jazz sounded so free, so relaxed, so weightless, and so breathtakingly beautiful. There's an alternate take in which the rest of the band has already moved on to the next harmonic change, while John Coltrane calmly continues soloing in the previous key. It's precisely these little imperfections that make jazz so special. They remind you that you're listening to musicians creating something unique in that very moment. Flamenco Sketches feels like the calm after the storm, a final deep breath before the album quietly fades into silence. A modal masterpiece of extraordinary beauty. We're staying with Kind of Blue a little longer, because at number 7, we find the blues-infused Freddie Freeloader. There are several stories about the origin of the title. More than one person has been suggested as the inspiration behind the nickname, but no one knows for certain. Either way, the title is far less important than what comes out of the speakers. For this recording, Bill Evans is briefly replaced by Wynton Kelly, whose more blues-oriented piano style perfectly complements the mood of the piece. Like the album's opening track, So What?, Freddie Freeloader is built around a hook of just 2 notes. But they're exactly the right 2 notes. Miles's modal jazz was no longer about virtuosity or speed. The 100 notes per second of his bebop years gave way to something entirely different. Here, Miles deliberately chooses space, silence, and timing. Notes that truly matter. And more than 60 years later, we're still grateful that he did. At number 6, we find the jazz standard My Funny Valentine. Countless artists have performed and recorded it, but rarely has it sounded as beautiful as it does in the hands of Miles Davis. Red Garland's piano arpeggios immediately draw you in, preparing you for what's about to unfold. And what follows is a muted trumpet that sounds almost mournful, so fragile, yet so deeply beautiful in a way that only Miles could achieve. Miles wrote an impressive catalog of timeless compositions himself, but he also had an extraordinary gift for making other people's music completely his own. My Funny Valentine may well be the finest example of that. We entered the top 5 the same way I once entered the world of jazz, with the opening notes of So What? I grew up listening to pop music and was familiar with just about every style within that world, but jazz was hardly ever played at home. Even so, I kept coming across the name Kind of Blue in the music magazines I devoured as a teenager. One day, I decided to take the plunge and bought the album. It turned out not to be just another record. It was a doorway into a musical world that I've never left since. My father introduced me to the Beatles and Van Morrison. I returned the favor by introducing him to Dylan and jazz. Of course, Kind of Blue has become almost a cliché by now. But clichés rarely appear out of nowhere. They exist because something is so extraordinary that generation after generation keeps coming back to it. So What may be the greatest proof of that. We now turn to Summertime, George Gershwin's timeless classic from Porgy and Bess, performed here in the unforgettable interpretation by Miles Davis and Gil Evans. Their arrangement may not be the most accessible version for everyone, but even outside the context of Porgy and Bess, Summertime stands as an absolute masterpiece. Miles' trumpet takes over the vocal melody entirely, while Gil Evans' lush string and brass arrangements float around it like a warm embrace. It's a combination that simply feels meant to be. A true musical match made in heaven. Where many performances merely reveal the beauty of the song, Miles tells its story without singing a single word. We enter the top 3 and return once again to Kinda Blue. As Willie Dixon famously said, the blues are the roots. Everything else is the fruits. And on Kinda Blue, the blues runs like a thread through the entire album. Nowhere is that more apparent than on All Blues. Interestingly, it's Bill Evans who takes the piano seat here. On Freddie Freeloader, he stepped aside for the more blues-oriented Wynton Kelly. Yet on what may be the bluesiest track on the album, Evans turns out to be the perfect choice. His playing isn't raw or flamboyant, it's elegant, subtle, and constantly in motion. That's exactly what gives All Blues its irresistible flow. It's this unique blend of simplicity, swing, and sophistication that makes All Blues so special. It's a piece that never seems to be in a hurry, yet never lets go of you for a single second. If I had to reduce Miles Davis to a single trumpet note, it would be his opening note on Blue and Green. That very first note cuts straight through your soul and sends shivers down your spine. Nowhere else did Miles pour so much emotion and depth into a single note as he does here. Not through grand gestures or technical brilliance, but through restraint. That's where his true genius lies. In terms of atmosphere, Blue and Green brings to mind Bill Evans' Peace Piece, which was created around the same time. The same stillness, the same vulnerability, the same feeling that time itself has come to a halt. If there's one ballad that represents Miles Davis in his purest and most vulnerable form, it's Blue and Green. This is the most beautiful sound ever captured in the grooves of a vinyl record. Yeah, but you say that about every song you love. That's true. But when it comes to Blue and Green, I really mean it. Before we reveal the number 1, let's first take a look at a few honorable mentions. We've already covered every track from Kind of Blue, so this gives you the perfect opportunity to rack your brain over which song could possibly have claimed the top spot. In no particular order, 7 Steps to Heaven. Fast, staccato, and irresistibly swinging. The sharp drum accents give the horn melody extra punch, while the band plays with a level of precision that's impossible not to admire. One of the finest moments from Miles' hard bop years. Time after time. The 1980s weren't exactly Miles's golden years, but this Cyndi Lauper cover remains one of the highlights of his later career. The production may sound even more unmistakably 80s than the original, but Miles's trumpet effortlessly elevates the song to another level. It ain't necessarily so. Alongside Summertime, this is arguably the standout track from Porgy and Bess. Miles's assured trumpet playing and Gil Evans's masterful orchestral arrangements create a wonderful balance between tension and release. It Never Entered My Mind. A deeply melancholic ballad in which Miles once again proves that emotion isn't found in playing more notes, but in playing the right ones. For a musician who spent his career pushing boundaries, he was also capable of extraordinary restraint. Walkin'! This hard bop classic simply had to be included. From the very first notes, the music surges forward, showing exactly why this recording became such an essential milestone in Miles Davis's artistic development. And then, we've reached number 1. Imagine you want to introduce someone to the music of Miles Davis, but you feel the Kind of Blue is just a little too predictable. Or, like in my case, you get comments from less adventurous listeners such as, "When does the singing start?" or "It's missing guitars." To spare both them and myself that conversation, I won't choose Kind of Blue, even though the album dominates almost the entire top 10. Instead, I'm choosing the track that, to me, represents Miles Davis better than any other. Milestones. From the very first note, it grabs hold of you. It's catchy, lightning fast, and built around a melody that lodges itself in your head instantly. To me, Milestones is the perfect example of how a great jazz composition works. An irresistible hook establishes the theme, after which every musician is given the freedom to tell their own story within that framework. And just when you think the music has wandered off in every possible direction, the main melody returns, and suddenly everything falls back into place. Especially in a live performance, that moment feels magical every single time. The fact that Milestones captures this entire concept in less than 6 minutes is an extraordinary achievement. And with John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones alongside him, Miles assembled nothing less than an all-star lineup. The melody is so infectious that I regularly catch myself singing it for no apparent reason, usually to the annoyance of anyone within earshot. I can't help myself. Milestones is simply irresistible, and that's why, for me, this is Miles Davis's greatest song. And those were the 20 greatest songs by Miles Davis. What's your favorite Miles Davis track? Let me know in the comments and vote in the poll. You can listen to the complete top 20, along with all the music featured in this series, through the Spotify playlist. And don't forget to check out the social media pages for all the latest updates. Because I will follow you, if you follow me. Last week, we covered all of Miles Davis's studio albums and ranked every single one of them. If you missed that episode, just click the card to watch it now. Thanks for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.